I hope you're doing well. Today we have a new watercolor painting tutorial of these lotus leaves and flowers. We'll go through everything step by step in this video, including the initial sketch, so I hope you'll enjoy following along. I'm using a B5 sized watercolor sketchbook and I'll be using watercolors together with colored pencils in this video. However, the colored pencils are not necessary, so you can achieve the same look with just a pencil and watercolors. But without further introductions, let's get started with the sketching part, and we'll begin by sketching all the leaves. I'm using this olive green pencil for it, but again, you can just use a regular pencil if you don't have colored ones, and we'll start with these leaves towards the bottom. I wanted the composition in this picture to be a little bit more dynamic, so we are drawing many of these leaves quite close here at the bottom edge, and then the biggest leaf will actually go at the top. I thought this would create an interesting balance in this picture where the elements are not completely even, and I was inspired by all of these Japanese and Chinese style paintings where the layout is often quite unbalanced in a way, and it makes the pictures very eye-catching. I've also watched a lot of painting videos after I started oil painting, and one thing I've learned is to not make your paintings, especially landscapes, too balanced, because then nothing really shows up in the picture. But anyway, here I'm just going ahead and trying to create pretty clean shapes with the pencil. I did do some very light sketching before I started filming, just to save some time here, and I'm trying to make the leaves look pretty interesting, not completely round, so we're gonna draw a lot of these little ruffles and folds all around. Having these very clean lines will help in the watercolor step, and keep in mind that you can't really erase the lines after you apply water to the picture. So if there are any extra lines left, now would be the time to erase all of them. I'm also drawing some of these little veins on the leaves, which we are gonna intensify later, but I think this helps to visualize the shape of the leaves a little bit at this point. After the leaves are done, we can move to the flowers, which go here in the middle. We'll start from the biggest flower, which goes a little bit more towards the top, and I took my time with these flowers. It will definitely help to have some kind of reference. It doesn't even need to be one picture. You can use multiple images and combine the qualities and shapes you want. I'm also using this brighter magenta colored pencil for the flowers, which will be a little bit closer to the final color. And I know that these initial lines might look pretty dark, but they will soften up quite a bit once we add the colors. I wanted the biggest flower to have a lot of these open petals and folds, and again, I'm trying to be quite precise with the outlines here. Basically, I want there to be no guesswork left once we add the colors, so that we can just focus on filling in the shapes. Drawing flowers is definitely not the easiest thing, especially something that has this many layers. So if you're just beginning your flower drawing journey, don't be too hard on yourself. Trust me, it has taken me so long and so many failed attempts as well to get to this point. Then I drew two smaller flowers here and I wanted to kind of fit them all into this space in the middle. So I wanted to have this almost L shape in the picture where we focus most of the details on the right side and then the bottom edge. And I think having that little bit bigger leaf here at the bottom left side offers enough balance so that it doesn't look too weird. I was actually drawing some sketches of the whole composition before I started filming, so you can see that in my little brown sketchbook. Anyway, I kept the other two flowers much simpler, so we have this one that's almost fully closed, and then this a little bit smaller one, which took me a few tries to get right and in the size I wanted. So you will see me erasing and redrawing, especially this flower. But now that we're finally done with the whole sketch of this picture, which definitely took a while, it's time to take out the watercolors and again we'll start painting from the leaves. I started with a pretty big brush here. This is a round brush in size 8 and I'm using a wet on wet technique for these large areas in the leaves. This will just let us blend a few different colors together seamlessly. Also, my notebook paper is not the best quality watercolor paper, so it dries pretty quickly, which is why I wanted to make sure that there was plenty of water on these areas before I went in with color. For some of these first shapes, I feel like I still didn't apply enough water, so it really depends on the paper you're using. The higher quality papers usually stay wet a little bit longer and allow you more time to work with the colors. I know it's a little bit difficult to see which colors I'm taking from the palette. I always struggle to keep the image large enough while also fitting the watercolor palette fully in the picture. And I also happened to have a lot of these green and grayish tones already on my palette here, which I was using as well. So I'll write the main colors on the screen, but as always, if you don't have the exact colors I'm using, it doesn't really matter. What we are going for are some types of grayish greens, and you'll need some kind of yellow ochre or brighter yellow shade as well for the lighter parts. I try to be very careful with the first wet layers so that I really go around all the outlines and all the little folds and curves, because if you forget to apply that initial water layer somewhere, you might have these small areas where the water doesn't blend when you add the color. It might also be a good idea to think about the intensity a little bit, so where would be your shadows or lighter areas. And we are also leaving all the folds white at this point because we want to apply a different color there. So if we add water to those areas at this point, it will be impossible to have a clean color difference. Also, if you feel like you want to add more darkness or more of a certain color somewhere, you can always do that on a second layer. If you feel like the initial layer has already started to dry down, it might not be worth risking it by adding more color or water on top, because that's how you might get some blooming effect with watercolors and some, uneven color spots. I tried to keep the top leaf a little bit lighter than the bottom ones and have some color differences in them in general. So I wanted some parts of the leaves to have a little bit more of this olive green or even yellowish shade, and then I added more of the bluish gray on other parts to create these color variations. After the first layer of these leaves is done, we'll start the second round here before jumping to the flowers. So now we are working on those missing folded parts on the leaves, and I switched to a much smaller size 2 brush here because the areas we need to work on require a little bit more precision. And I started from the first leaf we were working on because it has probably fully dried at this point. If yours is still wet, I would advise you to take a small break so that all the colors are definitely dry. So for this first bigger leaf at the bottom, I used a lighter color for these folded parts, and then I used a darker color for the rest because I want the bottom parts of the leaves to be darker than the side that's facing upwards. At this point, I thought that especially this darker area in the big leaf was a little bit too light from the bottom, so we are gonna fix that a little bit later. But again, I'm going to do that after I let these small folded pieces fully dry so that there isn't any color being transferred to areas where we don't want it to transfer. But now that we are done with the first layer of all the leaves, let's finally jump to the flowers. I was using the same smaller brush when working on the flowers because we have these tiny little shapes to color in, and we'll start by creating this very light layer kind of all over the flower. And I'm trying to create this ever so slight gradient where the tips of the petals are the darkest point, and then we fade the color a little bit towards the bottom or the inner part. To mix this light color, I'm literally using barely any pigment in my brush. It's mostly water, and if at any point I felt like the color I laid down was too pigmented, I cleaned off my brush a little bit, added more water, and blended that blob of color to a bigger area. Again, I'll add the color names I'm using to the screen, but basically I'm mixing a little bit of orange with these pinkish, red and magenta colors to add a little bit of this peachy hue to some parts of the petals. After we've gone over the whole flower with the lighter color, it's time to start a second round where we're gonna apply a darker color to all the folds that are facing us in the picture. Again, I tried to maybe add a little bit more color to the tips and slightly blend out the color towards the middle. And I'm also using this darker color to almost intensify some of the outlines a little bit as well. I'd like to mention that this step alone took me around 30 minutes, so I know it looks quick and fast in the slightly sped up footage, but in real life this is a very slow process because it takes a lot of time to create precise shapes. The only petals that I colored fully with this darker color are these middle petals that are completely facing us. So with all the other shapes, we are just using the dark color on these smaller folded parts. After we're done with the big flower, I moved on to the smaller ones, and we're keeping things a little bit more simple here. When it comes to this other flower that's slightly open, I especially wanted the colors to be intentionally a little bit lighter and with less contrast, so that this flower doesn't take as much attention in the picture as the big flower, which is kind of the main focus. After you're somewhat happy with the flowers, it's time to get back to the leaves and add a second layer if you feel like you need it. As I mentioned earlier, I definitely wanted to add a little bit more definition and darkness to some of these leaves, especially this big one. And to make the colors blend evenly with the first layer, you kind of need to add water to the whole area again. If you only add the darker color to the part that you want to make darker, it will create a pretty obvious dry line between that area and the first layer. So to keep everything very smooth and blended, you will need to add some water to the whole section. If you don't want to add darker color to the whole thing, you can just clean off your brush a little bit and blend clean water. And this is also why we need the first layer to be fully dry before we do this, because if you add water on an area that has not fully dried, it will create a huge mess and probably completely ruin the first layer. So I did this for all the leaves just to intensify them a little bit more, and after that all the main coloring is done, and the very last step we're gonna do here is add some details and lines using the colored pencils again. As I mentioned in the beginning, you can definitely do this with watercolors, with a thin, precise brush. I think you saw me adding a few lines here earlier, both in the leaves and the flowers. But I personally think that using colored pencils is just a little bit easier. You have more control with them, so that's why I went with that option. So I started by adding some of these veins to the leaves, and I'm just kind of winging this part. I did try to follow some of the lines I added earlier in the sketching phase, because you can still lightly see some of those under the colors, but I also added a bunch of small extra lines here and there and tried to add some of these extra veins that break from the main straight lines. After the leaves, I'm gonna do the same thing for the flowers, so I intensified some of the outlines a little bit and also drew these vertical lines from the petal tips to the bottom part. Doing this is not necessary, but I think it just adds a little bit of detail and helps to define the shapes a little bit better. But after you're happy with all your lines and details, we are finally done with this whole lotus flower painting. I really hope you found this tutorial helpful, and if you decide to give it a go, please let us know in the comment section how it went for you. If this was your first time around here and you'd like to stay tuned for more art and journaling stuff, definitely consider subscribing. But I think that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're having a lovely day or night wherever you are, and I'll see you in my next one. Bye bye!